Some of my collaborators on this are Michael Hedlund at UCSD, Chris Walker, now at Halliburton as of a week and a half, and I also had some slides from Lars Hoffman, who does atmospheric studies in Jülich, Germany. Okay. Just some history of acoustic studies or infrasound studies at the US Transportable Array. It was completely unexpected science to us that we would have an opportunity to do infrasound using USArray data. Now, the first inkling we had of this was the 2007 overflight of Atlantis over Southern California. The reason this happened was there was inclement weather in Florida where Atlantis was supposed to land, and so it landed instead just north of Los Angeles at the Edwards Air Force Base, and in San Diego our windows rattled, and pretty soon Debbie Kilb sent around a lot of seismic data showing that we had seen signals, shockwave signals from Atlantis, and at that point I realized that with so many seismic instruments nearby, perhaps we could actually do an infrasound study. So the first study that we did was an examination of shock waves coming off the ballistic trajectory of Atlantis. And this was sort of a proof of concept that infrasound at the USArray was going to work. And so we went on. There was a meteor in the northeastern part of Oregon, and we were able to do a few more complex infrasound studies showing multipathing and ducting within the stratosphere and even thermosphere. And finally, we were able to produce an infrasound source catalog showing areas within the U.S. That tended to produce a lot of infrasound signals. And of course, we could tell the difference between infrasound and seismic because infrasound signals have velocities of 280 to 340 meters per second. So they're easily distinguishable from seismic arrivals, but they do tend to complicate seismic arrivals because when you get the spike, you wouldn't know what it was necessarily. And that's why the infrasound source catalog was of interest to seismologists as well. Now, all of these studies were done using data from seismic instruments. And one of the drawbacks there was that we couldn't use amplitude data because we don't know what sort of, what the coupling is between the acoustic shock wave or the acoustic wave into the ground. So some funding was obtained to put pressure sensors in along with the USArray, and that was beginning in 2009. So about where this arrow is, about when the USArray had crossed, at least a third of the country. But fortunately, it got into an area Tornado Alley is around here. So we were able to start seeing some of the signals that were produced by tornadoes. I should add that we've also done some more infrasound studies using acoustic data at the USArray. For instance, the Chelyabinsk meteor was detected at distances of 10,000 kilometers and more at the USArray. But I thought what would be of more interest to seismologists perhaps was the gravity wave study. And when I start saying gravity wave, I should make a careful distinction between gravity wave and gravitational wave. Sometimes when I say gravity wave, people get really excited and think I've discovered gravitational waves at the USArray, which would be truly astounding because that has to do with the warping of space-time. And in fact, what a gravity wave is it's like a tsunami. A tsunami is an ocean, a gravity wave in the ocean. What happens is water is displaced and then gravity forces it back to its equilibrium position. So a tsunami is basically an enormous ripple on a pond. Now, in the atmosphere, what a gravity wave is air is displaced, and then gravity forces it back into its equilibrium position, and it oscillates about its equilibrium position. So we saw some gravity waves at the USArray, and we weren't sure exactly how to examine them. We didn't know how large they would be. And so what we did was we developed a method to break the USArray up into some very small subarrays, the smallest possible subarray, which is 3 components each, or 3 stations each. And I'll show the application of this method to gravity waves and comparison to satellite observations, and then I'll quickly show some other applications. Okay. So this event was brought to our attention by Bob Woodward. They had noticed a pressure signal, a very low frequency pressure signal crossing the array. And so what we have here is we have 2 to 4 hour bandpass data, pressure data. And at this frequency, velocities are between 20 and 60 meters per second. So it's a very slow moving wave. And the wavelengths are still hundreds of kilometers long because it's a very, very long period. But with a station spacing of about 70 kilometers, we can actually get coherent arrivals. We can actually see the wave field. And as I'll show in this next low-tech movie, we can see the wave field moving across, but it's not coherent across the entire array. And just for reference, the triangles are tornadoes identified by the National Weather Service. So stepping right through, we can see sort of a gravity wave up in this area, and this box covers 3 stations that I'll show in more detail later. And we also see some coherent gravity waves in this area. And I'm just showing about 8 to 12 hours here. Okay. And so the way we analyzed this is we had 339 stations that had continuous data for these 2 days. But gravity waves are not coherent, so we wanted to break them up into the smallest possible subarrays possible. And for that, we used Delauney triangulation, which is a method that's usually used to break up a model space for finite element modeling, but it works well at breaking up the USArray into small triangles as well. And in this method, in Delauney triangulation, you get, it divides a set of points up into triangles that are as nearly equilateral as possible. And for this, in this way, we can get an accurate azimuth estimation, because if we have some very long triangles, for instance, here, we wouldn't get a very good azimuth estimate. So we toss out all the triangles that really are not even nearly equilateral. And in this case, that left over 550 triads, or 550 subarrays, to analyze the phase velocity and azimuth. Okay, so I did the standard method of coherent processing at 3 adjoining stations. So here's this box blown up from those previous figures. Okay, so we have a coherent waveform going across, and we can analyze it to get the velocity and direction of propagation. And then we do that we analyze each of the over 550 triads separately, and we get something that looks like this. Okay, it looks a bit like pickup sticks. The color coding now is the phase velocity at each individual triad or subarray, and the sticks coming off of them show the direction of propagation. Now, this includes a lot of spurious detections. You might get spurious detections if you just have a signal that happens to cross one small subarray, or it could just be a chance cross-correlation that gives you a solution. So we clean that up by basically fairly arbitrarily saying that we would delete the detections if there were less than four adjoining triads that were consistent. And in this case, we get 2 areas of gravity waves. So this gives us an idea of the sort of area of the gravity waves that we can expect. Okay, So I'll step through that movie again, and now I have pressure on the left and the pixelated waveform on the right. So it's sort of a pixelated or digitized waveform now. And stepping through again, you can see, you get some indication of the dynamics of the gravity wave in this area. You can see it moving, most of it moving to the north, and there are parts that move to the south, away from the triangles that indicate they're tornadoes. Okay, so in this case, we still have just a pixelated waveform because we've separately analyzed each triad. We want to do some sort of ensemble processing so we can see the entire waveform. And an initial method was to compute the area of each large gravity wave to define a detection function. And in this case, for instance, for this particular time, we have two main areas as defined by areas that are connected by at least one station. And so we went through this to get a detection function, basically, for gravity waves, because when we saw this gravity wave at first, we didn't know if this was a unique feature or if these were fairly common features crossing the USArray. And in this case, now we have the circles color-coded to show the azimuth of each gravity wave area, and the solid line gives the total area. And this shows you that the gravity wave lasts about half a day. It moves as it moves from south to north across the USArray. Now, after we published this, we were able to get into contact with Lars Hoffman, who studies atmospheric infrared sounder satellite data. And he has an entirely independent method using the infrared data to detect gravity waves within the stratosphere. So actually within altitudes from 20 to 65 kilometers. And he showed that gravity waves look something like this as viewed by the satellite. If you were to compare these plots, so this is about the same time, if you were to compare these plots, you can see Great Lakes right over here, and Great Lakes are right over here on the USArray plots. So actually what we're seeing with the USArray is just the edge of this very large gravity wave that he sees. And also I've got some indication that what we're seeing are the north end and the southern end, or the bottom, of these half circles. And so what this does is it confirms that, yes, we are seeing the same sort of phenomenon that he sees up in the stratosphere, that these gravity waves go all the way from the surface to the stratosphere. Now, there are some differences between the satellite data and the USArray data, of course. The time sampling rate for the satellite data is 2 snapshots per day. So they don't get to see the dynamics. They don't get to see the evolution of the gravity wave as it starts and as it propagates. However, they have better spatial coverage. They can see basically the entire continent, whereas we see only a 2 million square kilometer strip of the continent. Now, that was not a one-off thing. As it turns out, these are more common. Here's another example about a month later. These are our pixelated gravity wave solutions. Here are shown 2 hours apart, and here is the equivalent gravity wave as seen by satellite. And now, as it turns out, when we went through the data, we found that those were not the very biggest gravity waves that could be seen across the USArray in that particular year. Here was one absolutely enormous event, and I wanted to show you because there are some particular interesting features with this very large gravity wave. Now, with a tsunami, if you were a beach goer and you see the waves go way out, away from shore, and you see it go way past the low tide mark, it's because there's opposing flow. The water is going in the opposite direction to the direction that the tsunami is coming in, and so there is opposing flow just before the onset of the tsunami, before it comes in and inundates the beach and villages and cities. We're seeing an equivalent phenomenon. We're seeing opposing flow coming just before the gravity wave. You'll see in the next few slides, the gravity wave is going to move to the north, but there is this opposing flow where the air seems to get drawn back or sucked back before the gravity wave comes in. And I don't believe that this has been seen previously, but you can see it in this very large gravity wave. Okay, and now a little more. We applied the gravity wave detector to all of 2011. And it was at this point that we found some of the very large gravity waves. This is the first one that we analyzed here. And when we analyzed the entire year, we discovered, in fact, that gravity waves are pretty much ubiquitous. And most of them, the color scale goes by azimuth. The green means the green dots are the ones that go from west to east. So, in fact, most of the gravity waves that we're seeing are associated with mountain waves over the Rockies. The air comes up over the Rockies and then it drops down again, creating gravity waves that go across the USArray. And then we found this very large one, which showed us the opposing flow in the gravity wave. More comparisons with satellite data. We found where gravity waves were most common, and we found that close to the Great Lakes, if you normalize by the movement of the USArray in and out of areas, we saw that there were the most gravity waves within the Great Lakes area and the fewest down in the Texas Panhandle, which is interesting because we can compare that to satellite data from Lars Hoffman. And he shows that there's a gravity wave hotspot or a high occurrence rate just over the Great Lakes using the satellite infrared data. So again, we're seeing about the same thing as the satellite data. But then going on very quickly to infrasound data, we found that we can actually apply this method to infrasound data as well, a modified method. Now, in this case, we don't have coherent arrivals across our array because the infrasound arrivals tend to have wavelengths of maybe hundreds of meters instead of hundreds of kilometers. So, however, they're impulsive, which means that we can form envelopes and we can cross-correlate the envelopes and proceed as before. And we applied this to meteoroids. And there are fairly common meteoroids over North America. And this was a case of one seen by many observers over Ohio, going from east to west. And when we analyzed that with our infrasound data, we found that we could determine the direction of infrasound propagation. And now the color scale is going from blue is early to red late, and we would see that there's infrasound propagating outward from that bolide, except in the direction just ahead of the trajectory. And we're collaborating with some researchers up in Canada on the infrasound from this bolide. And then, since I'm talking to seismologists, I thought I should show some possible application to seismic data, though I've seen from the posters and talks that there are similar methods being used in seismology. So there's some correspondence. You'll have coherent arrivals, of course, for very large events, and could hypothetically apply a method something like this to large events from seismic data. But perhaps more interesting would be to apply methods like this to serve as a detection function for much smaller events, which can only be seen part of the array. And now, to quickly summarize, I've just shown the automated gravity wave detector, which is useful for phenomena that are coherent over part of the array, but not for the full array. Some unexpected results from this were that the large-scale gravity waves are actually common over the TA, in fact, almost ubiquitous, and that the gravity waves that we could see on the ground were also observable in the satellite. And I didn't mention this, but one of the reasons that we have such an interest in gravity waves is that they are a major method by which energy from within the troposphere, the first few kilometers from the ground, is transferred up into the stratosphere. So this is really important for global circulation modeling. The atmospheric scientists are very interested in gravity wave observations and gravity wave dynamics, how they form, how they propagate, and so on, to put into their global circulation models. And another unexpected result was that we actually see opposing flow for very large events, and I don't think that this is something that has been observed before. And then, of course, there are other other applications for infrasound and possibly for seismology as well. And this project was supported by the NSF EarthScope program. Okay, thanks.
Questions?
So is it a prerequisite that you have to disturb the tropopause to generate these gravity waves? And did you see global gravity waves from the Chelyabinsk bolide in North America?
Okay, I'm not sure all the ways in which gravity waves can be generated, but I think it usually is from the bottom up. So it is from within the troposphere. They don't come down the other way, and usually. So it's often there's mountain-generated gravity waves. They're really common, and also storm-generated gravity waves are very common. And as for the other question about Chelyabinsk, we looked for the gravity waves, but we did not see them.
So I have a similar question. I didn't really follow what the sort of process was generating the gravity waves. At first you said it was tornadoes, but then we had this hotspot over the Great Lakes. So what's making the gravity waves?
Well, okay, for the particular examples, for the first example that I showed, it's almost certainly they're tornadoes. But it can be caused by the mountain waves, and I think perhaps they just propagate a little more efficiently towards the Great Lakes, and perhaps there's some sort of local storm phenomena that causes them there as well. I'm not entirely sure why the Great Lakes in particular. It's just that it was something seen in both the land data and the satellite data.
Can I do one follow-up? All right, so if it really is tornadoes,
And mountains.
and that's creating extreme low pressures, right? That's making the gravity waves.
Yes.
Do you see any coupling between the tornadoes and the seismicity in Oklahoma?
I have not looked, so I couldn't answer that question. Sorry.
First, a question. Atmospheric sciences obviously measure pressure a lot because they simulate it into models and all that. What's unique about what the EarthScope pressure gauges have contributed? Is it a better, higher density, or different sampling rate, or what's been kind of the major contribution from the point of view to potential contribution to atmospheric sciences? Because people measure pressure all the time.
Yes, of course. Yeah, it's the density. It's the fact that we had correlated waveforms Because we have station spacings of 70 kilometers on average, we can track the pressure as it moves from one station to the next. And
So the density is higher than what's normally measured in the atmospheric sciences?
yes, or at least it's all in one place. It's all available in one database.
And then a question about the gravity waves. Are we talking about internal gravity waves or barotropic gravity waves? I mean, you ought to be able to tell from the phase velocities. Do you have some idea about that? Because you talked about propagation of energy into the stratosphere, and those are generally by internal gravity waves.
Well, that was why we wanted to continue this study with Lars Hoffman, who was going to provide satellite data, because, yes, you can have those two different types of gravity waves, but the gravity waves of greater interest to the atmospheric scientists are the ones that are caused by convective behavior, and the satellite data, they are able to distinguish between convectively driven gravity waves and just the other mountain-generated gravity waves.
So depending on the temperature structure of the atmosphere, sometimes gravity waves are stable and sometimes they're not. I was wondering, have you looked into at all what the local temperature structures are and whether you have inversion layers or if that's correlated with when you observe gravity waves?
No, I haven't looked into that.
All right, no more questions. We'll move on.